The cold fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting long, jittery shadows across the apartment complex hallways. As I adjusted my security uniform, the familiar routine settled over me, a predictable, dull night of patrolling the quiet halls, listening to the occasional faint laughter or the low hum of a television seeping through the walls. It was always like this on the night shift, monotonous, uneventful. But tonight, something felt off. I couldn't quite place it at first. The air was heavier, carrying an unsettling stillness that I hadn't noticed before. The normally peaceful complex seemed almost too quiet, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. I brushed the feeling aside, chalking it up to the eerie silence of a late shift. The sound of my boots echoed as I moved along the empty corridor, the rhythm of small comfort in the otherwise still night. But just as I reached the stairwell, the radio at my hip crackled to life, startling me. A voice, faint, panicked, came through in broken gasps. "Help, please, he's here." I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The voice was raw, trembling with fear. My stomach twisted as I fumbled to respond, trying to suppress the surge of adrenaline rushing through my veins. "Calm down," I said, though my own nerves were fraying. "I'm on my way." "Stay where you are." The voice on the other end gave no reply, just the faint sound of labored breathing before the line went dead. I quickened my pace, my heart racing as I made my way toward the second floor where the call had come from. I wasn't sure what I would find when I arrived, but every instinct in my body told me it wouldn't be good. The hallway lights seemed dimmer as I climbed the stairs, casting strange shadows on the walls. With each step, the sense of unease grew, creeping up my spine like ice water. When I reached the door to apartment 2B, it was already ajar. Without hesitating, I knocked lightly and stepped inside, my hand hovering instinctively near my belt. The apartment was dimly lit, a single lamp casting a weak glow across the cramped living room. The air was thick with tension, an almost tangible presence that made my skin prickle. A trembling figure stood in the middle of the room, a neighbor, eyes wide with fear. They grabbed my arm the moment I stepped inside, pulling me toward the far corner of the room. Their voice shook as they tried to explain, words tumbling out too quickly. He's going to kill her. He has a knife." My stomach dropped. I followed their gaze to the corner, where a woman sat slumped against the wall, clutching her stomach. Her shirt was soaked with blood, her pale face contorted in pain. She wasn't crying, but her wide, terrified eyes spoke volumes. I crouched beside her, my heart hammering in my chest. "You're going to be okay," I whispered, though I wasn't sure I believed it myself. "Help is on the way." Her breath came in shallow gasps as she shook her head, her voice barely audible. "He won't let us leave. He's waiting." There was a fear in her eyes, something far deeper than pain. I glanced at the neighbor, who stood near the doorway, wringing their hands in panic. My mind raced, trying to process what was happening. I fumbled for my first aid kit, kneeling beside her and attempting to stop the bleeding as best I could. But something about the situation felt wrong, like I was only scratching the surface of a far darker reality. I kept my voice calm, offering her quiet reassurances, but the weight in the air was suffocating. Then, the neighbor gasped. "She went back," they blurted, their voice rising in panic. She went back to her apartment for her ID. My head snapped up. What? What are you talking about? The woman from the call, she went back to get her ID. She's still in the other apartment. For a moment, everything around me seemed to still. This wasn't the woman from the radio call. The real victim was still out there, alone, afraid, and possibly with her attacker. I stood quickly, my mind racing. Stay with her, I instructed the neighbor, motioning to the injured woman. I'm going to find her. The hallway outside apartment 2 was bathed in shadows. The lights above flickered, casting quick flashes of illumination, then plunging the space back into darkness. I approached the door, the uneasy silence pressing down on me. Something about this place felt wrong, as if the very walls were watching. The door to the apartment was cracked open, just a sliver of darkness visible inside. I hesitated for a moment, listening for any sound, any indication that someone was inside. Nothing. Just an oppressive quiet. Swallowing my apprehension, I pushed the door open slowly, careful not to make any noise. The apartment was dark, save for the faint moonlight filtering in through a small window, casting thin streaks of light across the floor. The air inside was cold, thick with a strange, metallic scent that made my stomach churn. "Hello?" I called out, my voice low, cautious. No answer. I stepped further into the room, my eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. Something wasn't right. The space felt abandoned, but not in the usual sense. There was a presence here, something lurking just beyond my sight. I moved toward the bedroom door, which was slightly ajar. The faint light from the window illuminated part of the bed, where I could make out a figure sitting in the corner, trembling. It was her. She clutched a small purse in her hands, her face pale and drawn. "I just needed it," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I needed my ID. I couldn't leave without it." My heart twisted at the fear in her voice. She had risked her life for something so insignificant, and now we were both trapped. I crouched beside her, trying to keep my voice calm. "Forget the ID. We need to leave. Right now." She looked up at me, her eyes wide and filled with terror. But before she could respond, a cold sensation crept over me, an overwhelming sense of dread that seemed to seep into the very air around us. We weren't alone. A shadow moved in the corner of the room, just at the edge of my vision. Slowly, deliberately, it stepped forward into the faint light from the window. My heart skipped a beat as I saw him, a tall, gaunt figure, his face half hidden in the shadows. In his hand, he held a knife, the blade glinting faintly in the pale light. He stood there, motionless, watching us with cold, empty eyes. His presence filled the room, suffocating the air around us. I could feel the woman behind me start to tremble, her grip tightening on my arm. For a moment, everything seemed to stop. The man didn't move, didn't speak. He simply stood there, the knife gleaming in his hand like a silent threat. I took a slow step backward, keeping myself between the woman and him. My mind raced, calculating my next move, but the oppressive atmosphere made it hard to think. "Stay behind me," I whispered, my voice barely audible. The woman clung to my arm, her breathing shallow and uneven. I took another step back, trying to edge us closer to the door. But the man moved quicker than I anticipated. He stepped forward, cutting off our escape route. His movements were unnervingly calm, deliberate. There was no rage in his eyes, no emotion. Just cold, detached intent. "Let's talk," I said, my voice strained. "There's no need for this." He tilted his head slightly, as if considering my words. But there was something in his gaze, something dark, something far beyond reasoning. He wasn't here to talk. He was here to finish what he started. A sudden, sharp ding echoed through the hallway, the sound of the elevator arriving on our floor. The noise startled him, just for a moment, but it was enough. I grabbed the woman's arm and bolted for the door. "Run!" I shouted, pulling her through the doorway and into the hallway. We sprinted down the corridor, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear his footsteps behind us, deliberate, unhurried, but terrifyingly close. The woman stumbled, nearly falling, but I caught her, dragging her forward as we raced toward the stairwell. The sound of our feet pounding against the floor echoed through the empty hallways as we reached the stairwell. We stumbled down the stairs, 2 at a time, the cold concrete steps slick with moisture. My mind raced. Where were the police? Had the neighbor called 911 like I told them to? We reached the lobby, bursting through the door into the night air. It was cool and sharp, biting against my skin, but we weren't safe yet. We needed to get as far away from him as possible. Standing outside the building, I scanned the empty street, my breath coming in ragged gasps. There were no police, no sign of help. The street lights above flickered ominously, casting strange, wavering shadows across the pavement. The woman collapsed beside me, trembling, her hands shaking uncontrollably. I crouched beside her, trying to catch my breath. My mind was racing, but one thought kept repeating: we weren't safe. I looked back at the building. The front door remained closed, the dark windows above staring down at us like cold, indifferent eyes. But I knew he was still in there, watching. Waiting.